Thanks, Rob. This is Susan Patrick. I'm the President and CEO for iNACOL. I want to welcome everybody to today's iNACOL webinar on E-rate basics for all of us in the field of K-12 education that are working to provide advocacy and policy. This is a thrilling time to be working on improving E-rate. As far as the webinar goes, I just want to walk you through on the left side of the screen. There is a button for our presenters to talk. It is a toggle on and off switch. If you go just below that, there's a place where all of the participants are listed. You can scroll down the bar and see who's participating, as well as the little icons for raising your hand if you have a question. We will be stopping at various points throughout the presentations after each speaker and making time for questions. The chat room in the bottom left-hand corner, we'd like to encourage everyone in the audience throughout the webinar to make comments, raise questions if you have them, point to resources in the field. We always have a lot of activity in the chat room. I will be facilitating and moderating today's webinar, so I will be sure and pull out questions in the webinar so those of you on the phone who are joining us on the teleconference line can also listen in. This webinar is live on the internet, and people have audio and capabilities online, as well as the ability to call in and follow the slides. The webinar will be recorded and archived for future use. So thank you again for joining us today. At the beginning of the webinar, we will move through quickly the basics behind E-rate to engage in a dialogue with our guest today, FCC Deputy Division Chief Lisa Hone, who we are thrilled is joining us for this live conversation, especially after the open meeting last Friday and announcing the work that the FCC is doing. So welcome to all of our guests and all of the participants today. John Bailey, the Executive Director for Digital Learning Now, will help walk us through E-rate basics as well as areas to watch out for and how you can get more involved. John Bernstein has been a real leader in the field of ed tech and E-rate. He is the co-chair of EdLink, the EdLink Coalition, and has been working on this issue since E-rate's inception back in 1996. We're thrilled that John Bernstein can join us today to walk us through some of the history and background context. Lisa Hone is the Deputy Division Chief. She is with the Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Wireline Competition Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. And Lisa, when we go through the basics and the introduction and walk through the history of E-rate, we will be turning over the conversation to you. I'll be facilitating questions so we can engage in a dialogue, and we are thrilled that you are joining us here today around the E-rate 101 basics for education advocates, with all of those joining us. So to get started, just as background, iNACOL is a nonprofit organization that works on policy advocacy, quality standards around new learning models, which are driven around transformation of education, and believe that blended online and competency-based education can dramatically change the system using advanced technologies to improve student-centered learning. With that, we're joined with Digital Learning Now and EdLink to help host this webinar. So the overview is really our goal today is to empower education advocates to get involved in the E-rate discussion. We're setting today's conversation up as really an E-rate 101 on the basics. We will be hosting future webinars on August 6th that look at understanding more advanced concepts and issues around drivers, strategies, defining capacity needs for the field. And so this is the first of a series. The topics that we will be covering today are the basics, some of the regulatory history, E-rate 2.0, what we need to be looking out for and how to get involved, and the discussion with Lisa Hone of the FCC. So E-rate basics. I will be covering this with John Bailey from Digital Learning Now. Where we are now. So newsflash, if you haven't seen it, last Friday the FCC launched an update of the E-rate program announcing a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Let's go back. E-rate was established in the 1996 Telecommunications Act. This was handled in the Commerce Committees of the House and Senate and signed into law. The E-rate, what it does fundamentally is provide discounts on telecommunications services, internet access, and connections to libraries and schools. Schools apply for the E-rate funding through the Universal Service Administration Company. Let's explore this a little further. John Bailey, can you walk us through some of the E-rate basics around Universal Service and the Universal Service Fund?
Sure, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is, Susan captured it nicely. It's a real exciting time, not just to be in digital learning, but I think to have the opportunity to take the E-rate program, which has been so successful in connecting schools, and really sort of help the FCC think through what a modernized reform program would look like. As Susan would say, the E-rate is part of a collection of programs, actually, that is part of the Universal Service Fund, which in turn is administered by a nonprofit contract with the FCC called BOOST. It's also important to kind of realize that how this is funded. We won't dive into the details of this too much today, but it's important to sort of understand the policy that Universal Service Fund isn't funded out of general tax revenues, but it's through a contribution fee system in which some telecommunications carriers have a fee that is charged to them. Often that has been passed down to consumers, and then that helps raise revenue that is then distributed out through the various universal service programs, including the E-rate. What does the E-rate fund? Well, it provides more than $2 billion in annual discounts to help schools and libraries, both public schools as well as private schools, obtain communications and internet access. The discounts range anywhere from 20% to 90%. And schools and libraries can apply on their own, or they can apply as part of consortia. Eligible services and the prioritization, the FCC, in terms of trying to help tier the eligible services, and one of the challenges, and this is leading up to some of the need for reform, is that the amount of funds being requested of the program always exceed the amount of funds they have available to give out to schools and libraries in the form of discounts. And so as a result, they've had to come up with both a list of eligible services as well as sort of tiered priorities to help fund a certain set of technologies first, and then a second set if there's funds remaining. The first priority is priority one is telecommunications services, telecommunications, and internet access. So think about this as sort of the broadband and the connectivity that gets to a school. The second set of funding is really what's called internal connections, and that is basic maintenance. It's everything you would have inside of a school to take the broadband connection from the school down to the individual classrooms. Obviously, there's a little bit more complexity here, but in a very sort of overly simplified way, those are the two big priorities. These are broken down further into, I think the list of eligible services now ranges about 53 pages in terms of the FCC outlining what's eligible and what is not eligible. The application process, this is sort of a simplified version of the flow chart that GAO drafted a couple of years ago, kind of showing what the process looks like from the applicant viewpoint, from USAC, which administers the program, and then from the service providers, so from the telecom providers and others that have to respond to various types of competitive bid requests, as well as fill out different types of paperwork. Just to go over a very sort of simplified version of this process is essentially schools in the past had to create a technology plan that talked a little bit about what they would do with both the E-rate discounts, but then also what isn't funded by E-rate, the computers, the professional development, the software, the online services. What is their sort of technology plan? That is now required for priority 2 services. There's been a little bit more flexibility granted for priority 1. At that point, schools enter into an open competitive procurement cycle. They post a form, they solicit bids, and sort of engage the different type of providers. They wait 28 days. They conduct a bid evaluation with the price of the eligible services being sort of the most heavily weighted factor. They then select a provider, and then they fill out a series of forms that essentially requests the funding from USAC. They provide the vendor contract details and then show the various types of discount calculations. That in turn sort of reserves the funds in USAC for that to be dispersed later on after the provider has provided the services. And there's various types of invoices and other sort of paperwork that goes to trigger that disbursement of funds in terms of a reimbursement from USAC to the provider. And so just real quickly, moving into the sort of the next section, the Digital Learning Now, we are an organization that was launched by former governors Jeb Bush and Bob Wise. We now work with state policymakers to help them with modernizing their state regulations and creating a policy environment that really supports next generation models of learning, everything from online learning, blended learning, and better using these connectivities. And so with that, what we're going to do is turn it over to John Bernstein, who, like Susan and I, have been around in the education technology community for a number of years, but John was instrumental in sort of the early days of E-rate and could give a little sense of the historic context of the FCC regulation and E-rate, and a little bit of kind of the political environment that led to some debates and some disagreements in the early days that got resolved, and kind of what we could expect from this new opportunity to move forward.
Great, thank you, John. So what I wanted to do today was give you a little bit of a historical context for what the E-rate is. And I think the most important thing for everyone to understand is that the E-rate originally was a very bipartisan program, and I think it still is today. The four senators who passed it, Senator Snowe, Rockefeller, Exum, and Kerry. Senator Snowe was Republican. The other three were Democrats. They were huge supporters of the program and helped push this through. The other thing that's important to understand about those two folks is that, about those four folks, is that they're all rural state senators. So this program is very focused on rural issues and making sure that rural connectivity occurs. It's not simply to make sure that it's only urban areas. It really is also very focused on rural. So I think that's critical. Let me give you a little bit of an introduction to myself. My name is John Bernstein. I co-chair the Education Library Networks Coalition. EdLink has been around since the early days of the program. We helped get it passed, and we continue to work on it to this day. Most of the major K-12 public and private education associations belong to EdLink, plus the American Library Association. And we are going to be very hard at work to think through this massive 175-page NPRM that just came out. If we can move to the next slide, please. I for some reason can't do it myself. We can probably move to the next one. Please move to the next. There we go. So what I think is really important for people to understand in this NPRM is that it raises clearly a whole host of issues. But a lot of these issues are issues that the program has faced, sometimes repeatedly, over the 15 years of its existence. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. I think one of the most important things for all of you on the phone to understand is that, at least from the schools and libraries perspective, funding is and has always been one of the #1 issues about this program. E-rate was originally, at least the size of the fund, was originally based on a McKinsey report, I believe, which dates back to 1998. That was well before we had access to smartphones and tablets and the wealth of digital materials that are available online, including digital textbooks. So it doesn't really contemplate that. When the cap was set, it was set at $2.25 billion. But one thing to bear in mind is that we didn't actually get to $2.25 billion until the second year of the program. Initially, only $1.8 billion was approved for the first year of the program. And by the way, that first year of the program wasn't a 365-day year. It was actually 18 months. So from the moment that E-rate became a reality, that $2.25 billion number was really the foundation of the program, but was also a number that was frequently oversubscribed. Even as far back as 1998, our first EdLink report, and we did a series of profiles in this program, showed that 15% of Priority 2 applicants were turned away. By 2000, we could not get below 80% eligible discount levels for Priority 2. 2012, last year, we couldn't get beyond the 90% range for Priority 2 applications. And now, this coming year, if there is no new money for E-rate, we are likely to see absolutely no money available in Priority 2. So funding is and has always been an issue, and I can assure you the schools and libraries community in this NPRM is going to be very focused on the funding issues. I believe that it's fair to say that whatever efforts are taken to trim and nip and tuck within the E-rate program in terms of eligible services, in terms of the discount matrix, we fully anticipate that those cuts are still not going to match the $5 billion demand this current year for the program, let alone what demand is going to look like 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. That's number one. Next issue is goals. Goals for the program have always been a really curious thing. We started off with this idea that E-rate was really just supposed to provide very basic conduit access connections to schools and classrooms. And back then, we were talking about dial-up access. And what we were most concerned about was getting all of those schools that had been not connected to the internet, and that's, by the way, somewhere around more than 80% of them, and back in 1998, to get them with some basic connection to the internet. And clearly, the program has been incredibly successful in establishing those basic connection rates. By 2005, we were certainly pretty much there with all schools and libraries that wanted to be connected. There may be 4 or 5% of schools that were not, but I would say to date we're probably at 100% connectivity, and I think a fair amount of the credit belongs to E-rate for that. But the question has always been, we've connected schools to the internet, but are they actually connected at adequate speeds to meet their needs? So increasingly, and even starting as far back as 2005, EdLink has been looking at different ways to measure the program. Because clearly, when you get to 100% of just pure connections, we're already there. But that's not enough. And to support digital learning, all the tools and the services that are coming, we really need to get beyond that, beyond just basic connectivity. We need to get an idea of speed and bandwidth level, and we need to make sure that everyone is where they need to be in order to make use of virtually all of the telecommunications and advanced services tools that are out there. So EdLink started talking about this back in 2005. 2013, it sounds like other people started climbing on board this idea of actual bandwidth goals. You saw the President, you saw Commissioner Rosenworcel talk about 100 megs per 1,000 students as an interim goal, with 1 gig as the ultimate goal. You're certainly hearing more and more commentary about those goals, and you see that reflected in the NPRM as something to be addressed. EdLink has not yet taken a position on what the appropriate measures are, but we think this is moving really in the right direction. One thing also that I'll mention here, and you see this in the NPRM, you'll see this notion of should we be measuring E-rate based on educational measures? Should we be deciding whether or not E-rate has been successful because more kids are passing state exams or some other academic measurement? EdLink has always not supported this. We don't think that the statute really calls this an education program. Remember that it was passed by the Senate Commerce Committee. It is a program that's located at the Federal Communications Commission. It is about connections. It is about bandwidth. It is not necessarily about improving the needle for test scores. We think that implementing high bandwidth and excellent technology and professional development, all those other components, really lead to 21st century schools where kids will do better. But I think it's a very difficult thing to draw a bright line between broadband and test scores, as it is with just about everything else. So let's move on to the next slide, please. If we could. There we go. Other things that have come up in this NPRM and that have come up many, many times before, waste, fraud, and abuse protections. There's no question that there were some issues with waste, fraud, and abuse in the early years of the program. There are numerous examples. There were many investigations and a fair amount of very, very painful hearings that I sat through in both the House and the Senate on this. The good news is that while you can never completely stop waste, fraud, and abuse, it has been tamped down considerably by all of the steps that the Universal Service Administrative Company has made or has taken to deter waste, fraud, and abuse. Some of the things that I think are very obvious to folks who are part of the program. There's a large auditing program. There are actual site visits now to schools and libraries to make sure the equipment that was purchased is actually being installed and used. There's a whistleblower hotline, so if somebody sees something amiss, they can pick up the phone and call USAC, and they'll take a look. There have been a prosecution agreement arranged with Department of Justice so that all the burden in investigating does not fall on the FCC. And that prosecutorial agreement has led to the debarment of a lot of bad actors. And when I say debarment, these are folks who, some of them were consultants, some of them were small-time business owners, some, unfortunately, were school folks, but who tried to perpetrate fraud on the program. A lot of these folks ended up in jail. A lot of these folks ended up having to pay fines. But you can be assured that all of them who were debarred are not going to be participating in the E-rate again. So that's particularly good news. Finally, there are additional steps that USAC has taken. They try to clear up a lot of things before the applications even happen, so they do what's known as ask visits out to schools and libraries to help them answer questions.
I think the other thing that's important and potentially problematic to some extent is that the federal gift rules are now being applied to E-rate participants so that schools and libraries now stand where federal workers currently stand in terms of their ability to accept gifts. And that way we hope there's no unnecessary thumb on the scale for what is going to happen with the E-rate during the application process. A couple other things I'll run through quickly. The structure of the program. There have always been questions about the structure of the program. The idea that we have a discount matrix that ranges between 20 and 90% is something that has been a great issue. At the very beginning of the program, in fact, some people suggested that E-rate should be a free rate. What was ultimately decided by the FCC in conjunction with the Federal-State Joint Board was that there needed to be some skin in the game for schools and libraries to value the services. So at a minimum, even the lowest discount or the highest discount schools, those are most in need, would still have to pay 10%. The question continues to arise, though, is 10% enough to value those services? That is squarely at issue, I think, within this NPRM, and it'll be curious to see how that comes out. The idea of turning the E-rate program into a pure per pupil grant program where you get a per pupil cost and there's some bump possibly for whether you're in an urban area or a rural area, that is certainly going to be something that's an issue in this NPRM. You've seen Funds for Learning propose this. You've seen Commissioner Pai propose a version of this. And I really do think that you're going to see people consider it quite heavily. There are issues with per pupil caps. There's a question as to whether or not that really works for rurals. I think a lot of these issues are going to be talked out during this upcoming NPRM process. Finally, the application process. Nobody likes it. Everybody thinks it's too hard. Everybody thinks it's too complicated. John Bailey's chart certainly shows that it is Byzantine. I will tell you that back in 1997, the first application I saw was written on a cocktail napkin, and a lot of people thought that was good enough. But of course, by 1998, when this thing was implemented, we were looking at dozens of paper forms. The good news is we've replaced the paper. We've substituted that for online. The vast majority, if not, I don't know, Lisa maybe can say, upwards of the 90s percentiles are applying online, and virtually everything goes online now. So it's a lot quicker process. Can this process be streamlined in other ways? Absolutely. Certainly we would like to see, as EdLink, multi-year applications for Priority 1 services, for the services that are essentially monthly telephone or internet access services. We would absolutely like to see that. And we think that would make life easier. And clearly, consortia have to be looked at as opportunities for streamlining this program as well. And let me just move quickly on to the last slide, and then I am done. So whoever's in charge of the slides. There we go. So two quick last things. One, there have always been a lot of appeals in this program. When people get rejected, they always are looking for a way to make sure they get their funding. Some of them are deserving, some of them are not. I can tell you that I spent a good 6 months doing appeals when I was the FCC, and it is not a fun job. But while there have been complaints that the appeals backlog is large, just purely the backlog of the appeals that USAC sees, in program year 2011, there were 1,800 of them, and it took 3 months to resolve each of those. So that's not a terrible number. I do not know what the FCC number is, but I'm sure that it is equally as large. So appeals backlog, there's always been concerns about that. Anything that can be done to stem that, I think people would like. But it's a tough job, and having worked at the FCC, I understand there are limited resources to address every single appeal that gets filed. Lastly, there have always been discussion about services. Every year there's an eligible services list that's posted. It contains some new services. It contains restrictions on old services. This year in this NPRM, you're seeing a discussion of eliminating some services as a way to save some money within the program. Voice is a service that has been around a long time. In fact, the original Communications Act talked about universal service as a residential voice program, and essentially E-rate, when it was passed in 1996, is an extension of universal service. So voice is a core component. By the way, back in 1996, as I mentioned at the top, voice was absolutely essential because dial-up was really all schools could do. So at this point, there's a question on the table as to whether voice should continue to be eligible, whether that's a way to save money within the program, because we really ought to be focusing on broadband in any case. There is a counter-argument that schools really depend on this, that there are safety concerns about having voice access within classrooms and outside of or on the school grounds. So I think there's going to be a big fight over voice, and we'll have to see how that ends up. With that, I will stop and turn this back over to better experts than I.
Thanks, John. This is Susan, and we have one question for you. Is EduLink collaborating with other large stakeholder groups such as SICA, ISTE, COSN, others to develop their comments to the NPRM?
Excellent question. COSN is actually a member, and I do work for COSN. I do represent COSN, so they're actually a member of EduLink. We have been conducting outreach and have been attending the meetings held by a variety of organizations, including the Alliance. I have been in regular contact with the State E-rate Coordinators Association, and in fact have even spoken with civil rights groups as of today. We are going to be talking with telecommunications providers because we think they're an important part of the equation. So yes, we are talking to anybody who's interested in E-rate and trying to work through what's in this NPRM and what everyone's priorities should be.
Thanks. And we had a good comment by Deborah Crete in the chat room here. As the NPRM pointed out, while the major forms are online, 470, 471, 486, there are many processes requiring applicant submissions that are not automated. Form 500, service substitution, invoice deadline extension requests, etc., just to name a few. The systems that were designed in 1997 were state-of-the-art then. While some of the systems have been updated, most have not. The FCC and USAC both recognize the need for major IT modernization effort that is very much supported by a wide range of stakeholders. So appreciate that comment, Deborah, very much. Any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat room. I had one come up that I'm going to hold until our conversation starts with Lisa. And certainly a lot has changed since 1996, including the technology. I want to thank you, John Bernstein, for that great overview on the history and some key issues that have emerged. I think on the question, is there a need to update E-rate for 2.0? The answer is clearly an increasing chorus across the field of yeses. How do we improve E-rate to better serve Learning 2.0? And to address this, I'm coming back to you, John Bailey.
Great, thanks so much. So there's, just to kind of help set the backdrop a little bit for what is creating the demand to dramatically kind of rethink what an E-rate program should look like today to support the types of technologies we have today, as well as the education reforms that are being put in place around the country. And I think there are sort of three big drivers here. There is with the Common Core, there's a whole retooling of schools with their curriculum, with content, and with resources, and also preparing for the new Common Core assessments, PARC and Smarter Balance among them, but there are some other ones too that are all being administered online. And I think what a lot of schools are finding out is that it's one thing to have students periodically throughout the day access an online resource, but it's a whole entire other scenario when you have literally dozens, if not hundreds, of schools all accessing the network at the same time to take a really kind of robust assessment the way that PARC and Smarter Balance are developing. And that in turn can crash the network. And so there's an urgent need to help equip schools with the connectivity that allows them to help accelerate their transition to Common Core and to prepare for these Common Core assessments. Digital learning generally, and this is really looking at the ways that data is personalizing education, the new tools and content and resources and services that so many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and a lot of teacher entrepreneurs are creating for students and teachers, all require pretty robust broadband speeds in order to have a great user experience and to really access those resources. And then finally, you have blended in online learning, which was very much sort of a fringe activity at the time that the E-rate was introduced. But now we have a scenario where you have over 30 states that have state virtual schools. There are more and more states on a daily basis that are passing online course choice laws, and schools that are embracing blended learning as part of the administration's Race to the Top District competition, as part of the Gates Foundation Next Generation Learning Challenges grants, and it's just part of their everyday sort of practice in which there is an assumption of the school model that students will be doing schoolwork using online resources at home or any place really that they can access those resources using broadband connectivity. And so as a result, you have learning models that are changing, that are putting a little bit of pressure and challenging the E-rate structure as it currently exists. And so huge broadband needs, as well as a need for rethinking kind of what the schools and learning looks like in the 21st century. And then there are just general questions too that I think John was talking about a little bit with the fraud, waste, and abuse. Can the program be strengthened in a way to help create better incentives for the use of the funds? Can the process be simplified and streamlined? The GAO flowchart really is a very simplified process description for this. When I talk to schools or libraries, this sounds like by far it's the most complicated program that they face every year, and that is in the face of programs that are dramatically larger in terms of Title I and a lot of other sort of federal programs and state programs. And so there's just this sort of spirit right now of how can we reform the program to make it simpler and easier for schools or for libraries to complete. And then there's also, what John mentioned too, that just this continuous sort of debate and discussion about what should the program support in terms of services, for whom should it support it, particularly along that scale in terms of relative wealth or poverty, and for how much, meaning how generous of a discount structure versus how much skin in the game should the applicant have. These have been constant tensions during the program, and very much, it's a chance here with E-rate 2.0 to kind of, talk about that, discuss it, debate it, and hopefully move some progress forward. Another huge element in terms of driving the need for a reform program, and John mentioned this too, is that the need as expressed in terms of services demanded through the application forms has nearly tripled since the program first was created, but the amount of programs, or the amount of dollars that have been available has pretty much stayed the same. And so you have increased demand with the relatively the same amount of program dollars, and as a result, it's crowding out what's available for the Priority 2 services, and it's creating more tension about how to reallocate the funds in a way that is fair, but also helps support the goals of the program too. And that is really kind of what is given some impetus to kind of where we are today, which is the opportunity to update E-rate, to modernize it, reform it, and to strengthen it. You had an FCC vote last Friday to unanimously proceed with a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Notice of Proposed Rulemaking is just sort of our Washington, D.C. talk for a document that asks a whole series of questions. And the FCC is very curious and asked what two colleagues told me yesterday, two E-rate experts told me they counted up about over 600 different questions in the NPRM. Everything from the goals to the eligible services to how the services should be allocated, and that is all part of this NPRM process. There are three different goals as part of the NPRM. The first is increasing broadband capacity. We'll talk about that in a second. Cost-effective purchasing and streamlining the program administration. The process for this is very different than what the normal public comment process is for a lot of executive branch agencies. So I know many folks are used to replying to comments as part of their state agencies or as part of the U.S. Department of Education when they do an update on Title I regulations. The FCC actually has a pretty cool process, and what they do is they release this NPRM. They ask for comments on one or all of the different questions that they ask. Those comments are due on September 16th, and then there is this neat process called the reply comment. And that is where John Bailey can introduce a comment and John Bernstein can introduce a reply comment saying he either agrees with John Bailey or he disagrees with John Bailey, and here's the reason why. And the FCC essentially gets to see the debate play out in real time in terms of the ideas that are proposed and the ideas that are opposed in many ways. From there is a final rule that is developed by the FCC. They can then in turn put it back out as an NPRM for comment, or they could take it to a vote and make the rule kind of final. I think Lisa will walk us through a little bit of what that looks like. Just borrowing from the E-rate fact sheet that came out of the Friday meeting, there are three broad goals that the FCC is sort of looking for comment and your thoughts and opinions on. The first is increased broadband capacity, and this is everything from simplifying the rules and fiber deployment to figuring out a prioritization of new funding for fiber deployment and for broadband capacity, phasing out support for eligible services for sort of previous generation technologies, things like pagers and basic telephone services, and also allocating the funding on a simplified per student basis. John mentioned this before, and there's some, as with all policy reforms, there's some strengths to that and there's some weaknesses, and the FCC wants to hear arguments for both. There's cost-effective purchasing, which is, when you have limited amount of dollars to allocate, what are ways to create incentives for consortium purchasing so that you're driving down prices? How do you do bulk buying with the types of services that would be purchased underneath an E-rate program? And how do you increase transparency on how E-rate dollars are spent? And do that in sort of a more modern way. Do it through less paper forms and more online. And is there a way to create a pilot program that incentivizes and tests more cost-effective purchasing practices? In another part of the Universal Service Program, the FCC just did a reverse auction, which is a way of sort of in real time, it's like a reverse eBay. You bid down prices in real time versus bidding up. And it was a way of allocating some limited dollars to help provide broadband services. And so, I think that they're interested in kind of new, innovative ways to help sort of drive down some of those costs. The Streamlined program administration, this is looking at everything from the forms to the way that the forms are processed by USAC, including how to more expedite the review of the applications, how to provide a streamlined electronic filing system, increasing transparency, and simplifying the eligible services list. I think as anyone knows that has completed these forms, there's just this is a target-rich opportunity in terms of simplification. That the forms right now are really complex, the process is really complex, and I think what ends up happening is that a lot of districts don't really count on these funds as much as they hope they get the funds, but they have to sort of wait, and this is an opportunity to create a more simplified process to create more certainty. And then there's a handful of other issues too. There's the Children's Internet Protection Act, which was a law to help protect children's privacy. The FCC is seeking comments on if that should be extended to the devices brought into schools and provided by schools for at-home use. in adjusting various changes to the school lunch program, which is used to help measure poverty, as well as a couple other different things too, including an interesting wireless community hotspot. But with that, I think what we'll do, because really when we were preparing for this webinar, the NPRM was still sort of conceptual. It was going to be released, but we didn't know when it was going to be released. And then just 48 hours ago, the document came out. And so we are very lucky to have Lisa, who is with us today from the Telecommunications Access Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau. And she can talk us through a little bit about the NPRM and some of the details that the FCC is looking for your input on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Hi, this is Lisa Hone. I actually don't really have anything to add. John did an excellent job summarizing the NPRM. I can see that there are lots of folks on this webinar who are familiar with the FCC, but for those of you who aren't, let me take a giant step back and just give you a little perspective. The Federal Communications Commission is an independent federal agency, so the chairman and the commissioners are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but the agency is independent of the administration. It's normally, at full force, it's a 5-member commission. Currently we have 3 members. It's a bipartisan commission. Our acting chairwoman, Mignon Clyburn, and Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel are both Democrats, and Commissioner Pai is a Republican. And the commission voted out this NPRM on last Friday, unanimously. They each have statements that you can see online, because I see on the chat that there's some people interested in the politics around it, and probably the best way to get a sense of that is to read the individual commissioner statements. But they did all vote yes to issue this NPRM and seek comment on reforming the program in the ways that John Bailey described. We very, very much want stakeholder input, and I would encourage all of you to provide input on some of the questions, if not every single one of them, because there are a lot of things we're seeking comment on. Although you're welcome to give comment on everything. We have a formal process, the comment and reply comment process. And just to be clear, if you choose to file reply comments, you don't have to be specific about what comments you are replying to. You can just file your own thoughts within the reply comment period. It is interesting for the commission and for staff to see the give and take among commenters, but don't feel like that's an absolute requirement to file something within the reply comment period. And this is what's called a disclose but permit proceeding. So we do what are called ex parte communications, so non-written verbal, essentially meetings with stakeholders. But then the stakeholders are required to file an ex parte notice with our secretary and in our docket describing those meetings, so that commenters and would-be commenters can see what conversations are going on at the commission with folks interested in weighing in on the NPRM. I can see Aaron Bendeley is asking about the fact sheet. All of this is available on our website at www.fcc.gov. And look, Maria even put it up already.
Thank you.
Does anybody have questions for me?
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. Thank you for that background. And we have some questions coming in for you. I've got 2 keyed up right now and hope others will come into the chat room. Russ Oldenburg asked, how aligned are the FCC commissioners for reform? Can you talk more about the anticipated opposition to the NPRM?
So, as a staffer, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to try and speak on behalf of any of the individual commissioners. Again, you're welcome to read their statements. All of the commissioners supported the NPRM and appeared to support the general goal of modernizing the E-rate program. I think John Bernstein pointed out that Commissioner Pai is particularly interested in the question of per-student allocation. That is, allocating money on a per-student basis with some adjustments for rural locations and for poor locations and possibly other adjustments. So So there is a section of the NPRM that seeks comment on that approach, and at the commission meeting he thanked his fellow commissioners for including that line of questioning in the NPRM. Commissioner Rosenworcel has done a number of speeches on E-rate reform and E-rate 2.0. Again, those are, in addition to her statement, those are available on our website. John Bernstein may want to add on here, but the things she's talked about include high-speed connectivity to schools, multi-year contracts, increased consortium purchasing. Those are the sorts of things that she's talked about in her speeches. And the chairwoman was obviously, and the way it works is the commission is the chairwoman essentially decides what goes on the agenda. So she is supportive of the NPRM and of getting high-speed broadband connectivity to schools and libraries. Now, I should say this is a notice of proposed rulemaking, so you shouldn't read anything into my comments in terms of thinking that the commission or the staff of the commission is leaning one way or the other. We are truly seeking comment, and we would like high-quality, data-driven comments so that we can make high-quality, data-driven decisions. So the more information you can provide us, backed up by evidence, the better staff here can do their jobs, and the commission can ultimately do its job.
Thanks. John Bernstein or John Bailey? I'll turn it to John Bernstein first to see if you wanted to add anything.
I mean, I think Lisa was right on. From my perspective, the most important thing that came out of Friday, outside of the NPRM, is the fact that all three commissioners voted for it, Democrats and Republicans. Again, this is a bipartisan thing. And the conversation, which, by the way, was not the conversation necessarily back in 1996 in Congress, is that the E-rate is a success story. And the question is about how do we make E-rate better, not how do we end E-rate. I think everyone, whether you're a Democrat or Republican commissioner, agrees that there's some changes that need to be made to the program to improve it, to modernize it, and bring it up to date. The fault lines are going to be in a lot of different places. Commissioner Rosenworcel has pushed for goals. Commissioner Pai is concerned about goals as looking like a federal mandate. Commissioner Pai has expressed concerns about doing anything that would increase the amount of money in the program, thinking that it can live within its means. You've seen Commissioner Rosenworcel and some of her statements indicate the need for more funding for the program. So that's going to be a fault line. And the other thing you have to bear in mind is we're talking about three commissioners right now. By the time this comment period closes, you may very well have a new chair. President Obama has nominated Tom Wheeler to be the chair, and you may have another Republican commissioner. So those personalities and their interests are going to have to be factored in. But I think that the conversation is proceeding in a really good fashion. They are talking about the value of the program, how do we make the best use of the program, and how do we move it forward. And I expect that that conversation in its very civil tone will continue, and that hopefully within a relatively short order, we will actually have an E-rate 2.0.
Yeah, maybe just to add a couple points, just to underscore a couple things that John said. As someone who was around during the first round of E-rate battles in the 90s, and then various types of ways that politically this became under some issues of debate at various points in its history. I think the most significant thing is that you had three FCC commissioners over the last 2 months put out plans for reforming the program, and to John's point, not sort of ending it. And that is a positive sign. I think the issues are going to be, the debate isn't about reforming it or not reforming it, but how to reform it. And this very much mirrors the debate we're having in the broader education space about, it's not should we reform No Child Left Behind, but what's the best way to reform it. And John covered, I think, a bunch of those kind of fault lines that we'll see some conversation and debate around in terms of how the funds should be allocated, what services should be covered, what services should not be covered. if there is an increase in the size of the fund, where do those additional dollars come from? And that's a particularly sort of sensitive topic that is bigger than just E-rate, but is one that would have to be sort of tackled by the Commission. And I think there's going to be some other sort of tricky things too. The FCC tried a mobile learning pilot. I think it was about 2 years ago, and I think that is up for consideration about how that should be extended or not extended as part of this. The issues that I think we were talking a little bit about with online learning and blended learning creates a lot of challenges for the program, and that's going to be one that will have to be wrestled with as well. But the great thing about this is that this is a very sort of open process that Lisa outlined in terms of the chance for you to literally be able to provide comments on your thoughts, ideas, and opinions and arguments for and against to kind of help inform and influence the way that the FCC considers this and thinks about this.
Thanks, John. John and
yeah, and let me
go ahead.
Sorry, this is Lisa. Let me mention one thing that I don't think hasn't really come up is that in terms of proposing to make sure that schools and libraries have access to high-speed connectivity to and within their facilities, the NPRM sees comment on speed targets, and particularly on some speed targets that the State Education Technology Directors Association has proposed, which line up with what President Obama has proposed in the ConnectEd initiative. So I would also call people's attention to that issue. Should we have specific targets for connectivity speeds, and if so, what should they be? And as I said, the State Education Technology Directors Association has done some great work around this. There's been some work done with respect to libraries, but less with respect to libraries. And then there's associated questions around broadband performance, so things like jitter and latency. And so we seek comment on performance measurements.
Great. That's a great point to bring up too. Switching over, I've got questions from Kim Friends, Mark Schneiderman, and Lucy Getman. Kim Friends asked, does the 2013 no funding or lack of funding for Priority 2 situation look to have no solution, or are there any discussions about supplementing 2013 to bridge that gap? Or are there other solutions to address the shortfall? Lisa, is that something you are commenting on?
Well, I'm not making news here, which won't surprise Kim. The past several years we've had substantial carry forward funds, that is funds unused in previous years that we've been able to carry forward to fund at least some P2. This year we actually had to use carry forward funds to ensure we could fund all of P1. And so there's no immediate resolution to the question of whether there will be any money available for P2. And it's not something that's directly teed up in the NPRM, given the timetable of the NPRM versus the funding year.
I don't know if John or John, you have any other comments on that, or I'll move to the next question.
Well, all I'll say is, I mean, it is a real problem. And, depending on how long E-rate reform takes and how long until we actually see some sort of funding increase in the program, this is not a 2013 alone problem. Because once you get through no money for P2, the next thing that has to happen is that you have to start prorating P1. So you start losing dollars to the very basic services of the program. So yes, this is a big problem, but it is just the tip of the iceberg, and it gets much worse the further below the surface you get.
Thanks. And I see Giselle Huff also has her hands up, so I will do Mark's, Lucy's question, and then go to Giselle. So Mark Schneiderman's question is for Lisa. Is there a formal, parallel, or related process expected soon related to contributions at large for USAC programs? Are contribution issues included in the E-rate NPRM? Thanks.
So what Mark is referring to is the fact that all 4 universal service funds, money for all 4 universal service funds are collected through the contributions process that John Bailey described, and USAC administers all 4 of the programs. There is an open, I think it's actually a further notice of proposed rulemaking with respect to contributions. We have not done separate contributions rulemakings with respect to the different programs, but there is an open rulemaking on contributions issues that's currently pending at the agency. The E-rate NPRM does not ask about contributions issues. It does see comment on how much it would cost to do the kind of high-speed connectivity that is proposed in the NPRM and to fund schools' needs both to the school and within the school, and to the libraries and within libraries.
Thank you. Lucy Getman has another question. Would the FCC consider extending the comment period? Such a wide-ranging and historic inquiry into E-rate modernization deserves thorough consideration, and September 16th is a pretty tight response time. I'll add, are there more than one periods to comment, or is this comment period between now and 16th, this tight timeline, the only one? It's a good question, Lucy.
So Lucy, I think you win some sort of prize for asking 3 days in whether we're going to extend the comment period. I'm not surprised to hear the question, but the thing is, this is actually a very long comment period for us. Normally we do a 30-day and then 15-day comment period, longer and bigger proceedings for sure, but the commissioners were very cognizant of the fact that August is a rough time for everybody to get comments together, but especially for schools, folks who are trying to finish vacation and get geared up for school, a new school year, and so that is the reason actually that the comment period is pushed as far back as it is, and why the reply comment period is a full 30 days. It might be 31, I have to do my count, but the thing is, there's some tension here, right? We want to get really high quality comments, and we want to give people the time they need to prepare those comments and then to engage with the commission and with each other. At the same time, there's a real recognition of the need to move forward on reform, and issuing the NPRM is really just the first step in doing that. So the commission adopts the NPRM, then it's released. Both of those things have happened. Then we have a comment period, we have a reply comment period. During that time and afterwards, people have the opportunity to come in and meet with the commissioners, commission staff, and do it by telephone or in person for ex partes. The staff has to make recommendations. The commissioners have to decide where they are. Eventually, an order has to be circulated. The circulated order is negotiated. Eventually, the commission might vote out the order. And then after that comes the part that staff hates the most, which is Paperwork Reduction Act approval. So to make changes to any of the information that we collect as part of this program, so we tend to think of it as forms, but it's not really forms. It's any information collection. We then have to go through an extensive OMB process at the Office of Management and Budget, which usually takes another 180 days, which is 6 months. There's an emergency process in which you can do it in 90 days, which is 3 months. So we're talking about a really long timeline, even if everybody moves as fast as they can, all of which is to say there's a tension between 3 commissioners who want to move forward as quickly as possible and lots of stakeholders who want that too, and wanting to get the best quality comments and product that we can get. So I think it's premature to answer the question about extending the comment period, but I want to give you a context for why, for the pros and cons of even thinking about doing that. It's probably a longer answer than you wanted, huh, Lucy?
This is John Bailey. Maybe, Lisa, just a follow-up question on that. Maybe instead of extending the comment period, the one sort of question that I think is sort of out there is that the this current NPRM asks very sort of broad questions, but doesn't sort of lay out a straw man of a program for folks to react to. And I think, by my count, if you count the FCC commissioners and Funds for Learning, SECA, folks like education superhighway folks, there's probably 6 or 7 different sort of plans out there already before the NPRM even started. Once you go through this comment period, would the FCC develop sort of the framework of a draft revised E-rate 2.0 and then put that framework back out for comment, or would that go just strictly up to the FCC for voting up or down?
Not necessarily. It would not. This is going to be repetitive. It would not necessarily be necessary for the commission to put something else out for comment. So if you look, the commission actually has reformed all 4 of its universal service programs in the last few years. The E-rate program was reformed first in 2010, and it was sort of reform light compared to the other programs. But Lifeline, the high cost program, and the rural healthcare program underwent massive reforms. And in each of those cases, the commission did not go back out with a second NPRM. But I believe in all 3 of them, or at least in 2 out of 3, the commission did go out with what's called a public notice, or the Bureau, the Wyoming Competition Bureau, put out a public notice seeking further comment on some very specific issues. But not with the sort of skeleton that you're describing.
Great, thanks. And I see we're at the top of the hour, so we'll stay on just a few minutes for those that have additional questions. For those of you that have to jump off, I want to thank you. Giselle, I see you have your hand raised, so I wanted to call on you for the final question here, and feel free to toggle on and off the microphone or just type it in. Okay, with that, I want to thank everybody for joining this and let you know this is the first of a series on advanced E-rate that will be taking place. And I especially want to thank Lisa, John, and John for your leadership on this issue and working. We'll be working together and happy to coordinate and help share information and resources across the field. Our next E-rate webinar is going to be a more advanced discussion around the needs of the field, strategies, drivers, and helping to define capacity. We mentioned education superhighway, and we'll be doing this in partnership with other leading education organizations. I see Peter Zamora from the CCSSO has joined us here. So to all of you at Link, DLN, and your organizations across the field of education advocacy, and especially to Lisa at the FCC, I want to thank you for participating today, and we'll look forward to this being the first in an ongoing conversation to help build capacity in the field to respond and give you the very best comments to improve E-rate 2.0 for the 21st century. So thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.